The iron spade bit into the earth with a dull thud, a sound swallowed by the vast, silent basin of the valley. Elias drove the blade down again, his weight thrown into the motion, his shoulders already beginning the familiar ache of a long day's work. The soil, still clinging to the memory of the last frost, was dense and unyielding. Beside the slowly lengthening trench, a large, brindle-coated dog named Barrow sat with the patient stillness of a stone, his intelligent eyes tracking the rhythmic rise and fall of the shovel. Barrow's tail gave a single slow thump against the ground when Elias paused to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, a gesture of quiet solidarity. It was the first week of May, and the ground held a deep, stubborn cold. The trench was 4 feet deep and 3 feet wide, its walls cut with a precision that spoke of careful planning. This was the first of many. It snaked away from the small, sturdy cabin his father had built, a dark scar on the greening land. Elias worked from a set of drawings his father had left behind, pages of brittle paper filled with meticulous diagrams and notes written in a fading, spidery hand. They were not plans for a root cellar or an irrigation ditch. They were for something else entirely, something the locals had already started to talk about. Mr. Henderson was the first to stop. He reined in his horse at the edge of Elias's property, his old, weathered face a mask of confusion. He was a man who had seen 70 winters in this valley, a man whose knowledge of the land was written in the deep lines around his eyes. He watched Elias heave another shovelful of dark earth onto the growing mound. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Henderson's voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Elias stopped, leaning on the handle of his spade. He nodded a polite greeting. "Digging." "I can see that," Henderson grunted, dismounting. He walked closer, peering into the trench as if expecting to find gold. Barrow lifted his head but made no sound. "This is a fool's errand. What's it for? You can't plant this deep, and it's too wide for a simple drain." Elias looked at the trench, then back at the older man. "It's a heat tunnel." Henderson stared, his mouth slightly agape. He let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a bark. "A what? A heat tunnel? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You plan on warming the whole valley with a ditch?" "Just this part," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. He gestured with his chin toward the cabin, the small barn, and the patch of land he intended for a winter garden. "The ground freezes 6 feet deep here, son, sometimes more. Whatever heat you think you're catching will be gone by the first real snow. Wait until winter. The frost heave will collapse this thing before you even get a fire lit, if that's what you're planning." Henderson shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Your father was a good man, Elias. A bit of a dreamer, but a good man. Don't waste your inheritance on his fantasies. Fill this in. Build a bigger woodshed. That's how you survive a winter here." Elias listened without argument. He had heard variations of this sentiment his whole life, whispers about his father's strange books and his belief that the earth held its own warmth, a deep, abiding heat that could be coaxed to the surface. He simply nodded again. "I have a plan." Henderson sighed, mounting his horse. "A plan for ruin, looks like." He clicked his tongue, and the horse trotted off down the dirt track, leaving Elias alone with his work, the silence, and his dog. Barrow nudged his head against Elias's leg, a warm, reassuring pressure. Elias reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, his gaze fixed on the long, dark line he had carved into the earth. It was only the beginning. He had 300 feet of tunnel to dig and line with stone before the first snows came. He picked up the spade. The sun was high, and the day was still long. The ground waited. The work became the rhythm of his life. Dawn broke with the clang of the pickaxe against stubborn rock, and dusk fell to the scrape of the shovel against packed earth. He ate standing up, bread and dried meat held in one dirty hand, his eyes scanning the lines he had staked out across the property. The initial trench grew, branching into a complex network that circled the cabin and the small plot of land beside it. He followed his father's drawings precisely, a web of interconnected channels all sloping gently toward a central point a dozen yards from his front door. This was where the heart of the system would be, the hearth. His hands, already tough from years of farm work, became landscapes of their own. Blisters formed, broke, and healed into thick, yellowed calluses. The muscles in his back and shoulders coiled into hard knots. Some nights, he would fall into his cot too exhausted to even wash, the smell of soil clinging to him like a second skin. Barrow would lie on the floor beside him, a furry, breathing anchor in the quiet darkness, his soft snores a counterpoint to the ache in Elias's bones. By midsummer, the digging was done. The homestead looked as though it had been scarred by some giant, burrowing creature. Now came the second, harder task, lining the tunnels with stone. He spent weeks down at the creek bed, wrestling river stones from the water's grip. He chose them with care, flat and dense, ranging in size from a loaf of bread to a small sheep. He used a wooden sled, a contraption of his own design, to haul them up the slope to the cabin, 200 pounds at a time. Barrow would trot alongside him, tongue lolling, occasionally nudging a stray stone with his nose, as if to help. The town's skepticism grew with the piles of rock. Mayor Thompson, a man whose wealth was measured in cattle and land, rode out one afternoon, his fine horse picking its way delicately around the trenches. He did not dismount. "Henderson tells me you're building a subterranean furnace," Thompson said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Elias, your father was a respected man, but his ideas were unconventional. This project is making people in town uneasy. It's an eyesore, and frankly, it's a waste of good labor that could be spent clearing timber or mending fences." "It'll work," Elias said, placing a heavy stone into the wall of the trench. The fit was nearly perfect. "And what happens when it doesn't?" the mayor pressed. "What happens when the ground shifts and your cabin's foundation cracks? What happens when you've spent your entire summer on this folly and you don't have enough wood split for the winter? We're a community, son. We look out for each other. But we can't help a man who won't help himself." Elias wiped his hands on his trousers and looked up at the man on the horse. He said nothing. His silence was not defiance, but a simple inability to explain in words what he understood in his hands, in the heft of the stones, in the elegant logic of his father's diagrams. The proof was not an argument, it was in the building. Thompson huffed, seeing he would get no further, and rode away, shaking his head. Even Mrs. Gable, who had brought him stew and bread after his parents passed, stopped by, her face etched with worry. "Elias, dear," she began, wringing her hands. "People are talking. They say you're trying to change the seasons. That's God's work. This isn't natural. That boy will freeze himself to death chasing his father's ghosts, they say." "I'll have a fire, Mrs. Gable," he assured her gently. "A very big one." She did not look convinced. She left a loaf of cornbread on his doorstep and departed, her worried glances trailing behind her. He met Anya during this time. She didn't come to gawk or to judge. She brought him a bucket of cool well water one sweltering August afternoon. She was the blacksmith's daughter, with observant eyes and hands that were strong and capable from her own work. She didn't ask him what he was building. She asked him how. "How do you get the stones to fit so tightly?" she asked, watching him set a large capstone over a section of the trench. He used no mortar, only skill and patience, finding the perfect fit for each piece like a massive, three-dimensional puzzle. "You look at the shape of the space first," he explained, his voice rough from disuse. "Then you look for the stone that wants to go there. You have to see it before you lift it." She nodded, understanding. "My father does the same with iron. He says the shape is already in the bar. You just have to heat it and help it find its way out." She started visiting regularly after that. Sometimes she brought food. Other times she just sat on a log with Barrow resting his head in her lap, watching Elias work. She never offered advice or expressed doubt. She simply watched, her presence a quiet pool of acceptance in a sea of skepticism. He found himself talking more with her than he had with anyone in years, explaining the principles of the design, the deep, insulated hearth that would burn slow and hot, the carefully angled vents that would draw the warm air through the stone-lined tunnels, the way the earth itself would become a massive, gentle radiator, holding the heat long after the fire died down. "The stones hold the memory of the warmth," he told her one evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the nearly completed tunnels. "That's what my father wrote. They soak it up and release it slowly. The ground insulates them. The cold stays on the surface, but the warmth travels underneath." "It's beautiful," she said, not of the scarred landscape, but of the idea itself. "It's like listening to the earth instead of shouting at it." By the first frost of October, the work was done. The last capstone was laid, and the trenches were covered over with the excavated soil, mounded up in long, low berms. All that was visible of the massive undertaking were 16 small, stone-hooded vents dotting the property, looking like miniature tombstones, and the deep, stone-lined pit of the central hearth, protected by a low wall and a clever roof structure that left a wide opening for smoke. He spent the next month splitting and stacking wood, far more than anyone thought necessary. He filled his own woodshed, then built another and filled that one too. The pile of cordwood was immense, a fortress against the coming cold. The town watched. They saw the strange vents, they saw the mountain of wood, and they waited. "Wait until the first big storm," Henderson was heard to say at the general store. "That's when the earth will have its say." The first snow fell in early November, a light dusting that melted by noon. But the air had changed. A deep, predatory chill was creeping down from the northern peaks. Elias could feel it in his bones. Barrow felt it too, growing restless, his ears twitching at the sound of the rising wind. Elias laid the first fire in the great hearth, a slow-burning bed of oak and hickory. He watched the smoke curl up and away, and he placed his hand on the ground near the closest vent. It was still cold. He knew it would take time. He settled in to wait. The earth was slow to anger and slow to warm. Patience was the key. He had given it his summer. Now, he would give it his faith. The winter began as a quiet affair, a series of modest snowfalls and cold snaps that were unremarkable for the region. The ground around Elias's vents remained stubbornly free of snow in small, perfect circles, a fact noted with curiosity by the few who passed his homestead. Henderson, riding by one morning, saw the thawed patches and grunted. "Ground's still warm from the summer," he called out to Elias, who was clearing a path to his barn. "That won't last. Wait until the deep cold sets in. That's the real test." Elias just nodded and continued his work. He kept the fire in the outer hearth burning day and night, a slow, steady blaze that consumed logs with a miserly appetite. The design was efficient, pulling air through vents at the base, ensuring a hot, complete burn. The stone of the hearth itself was now perpetually warm to the touch, and the ground for 20 feet around it was soft and damp. A strange island of autumn in a world of hardening frost. Anya came often, her visits a source of quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They would sit on the bench inside his cabin, sipping hot tea, while Barrow snoozed at their feet. The air inside was different from any other cabin in the valley. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a pot-bellied stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. There were no cold spots, no drafts that snaked along the floor. "It's like the house is breathing," Anya said one afternoon, holding her hands over the floor. "I can feel it. It's a living warmth." Elias had laid a shallow extension of one of the tunnels directly under the cabin's foundation, a detail from his father's most ambitious sketches. "The stones under the house are warm now," he explained. "They heat the foundation, and the foundation heats the floor." Their relationship grew as the winter deepened, a slow and steady blossoming like a patient winter rose. They spoke of the future, of gardens and children, their plans woven into the fabric of this strange, warm patch of land he had created. They were married by the traveling minister just after the New Year, in a simple ceremony inside the cabin. Mrs. Gable came, and a few others from the town, their faces a mixture of goodwill and persistent doubt. They remarked on the cabin's comfort, but their eyes still held a question. The real winter, the one that broke spirits and claimed livestock, had not yet arrived. It came in the second week of February. It had no name at first, just a change in the sky. A high, thin layer of cloud that turned the sunlight a pale, watery yellow. The air grew unnaturally still, and the temperature began to drop, not gradually, but in a swift, merciless descent. The old-timers felt it in their joints. The animals felt it in their blood. Barrow refused to leave the cabin, pacing anxiously by the door, a low whine in his throat. By evening, the wind began to howl, a low moan that grew into a shrieking banshee's wail. The snow didn't fall so much as it flew, a horizontal blizzard that erased the world, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. Elias went out to the hearth, bundled in every layer he owned. The wind tore at him, trying to steal the breath from his lungs. He loaded the hearth with the largest oak logs he had, logs that would burn for half a day. The fire roared, a defiant beast battling the storm, the smoke whipped away instantly into the white chaos. For 3 days, the storm raged. The temperature, measured by the old mercury thermometer on Elias's porch, plummeted. It fell past 0, past 10 below, past 20, 30. It finally shuddered to a halt at 45 degrees below 0, a temperature that could freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. It was a cold that killed, a cold that cracked trees and turned metal brittle. In town, families huddled around their stoves, burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate. The wind found every crack in their homes, every chink in the mortar. Windows frosted over with thick, opaque ice. Inside Elias and Anya's cabin, it was 70 degrees. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally lessened, though the snow still fell, thick and heavy. Elias opened his door to a world transformed. The snow was piled in monstrous drifts, some reaching the roofline of his cabin. A wall of white blocked his view in every direction. But directly in front of the cabin, in the area circumscribed by the heat tunnels, the world was different. The ground was not bare, but it was not buried. A gentle 6-inch blanket of soft powder covered the earth, a stark contrast to the 10-foot drifts just yards away. The vents were clear, each one a small, dark mouth breathing a faint, shimmering plume of vapor into the frigid air. The path to the barn was a shallow dip in the snow, easily shoveled. The great hearth, though nearly buried in a drift on its windward side, still burned, its chimney of smoke rising straight into the still air. Anya came to the door, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. She looked at the scene, her eyes wide with wonder. "Elias," she breathed. "It worked." He took her hand, his heart full. "I have a plan," he said, the words feeling different now, heavier with the weight of proof. Later that morning, their first child, a son they named Samuel, woke from his nap. He was just over a year old, sturdy and curious. Bundled in a thick wool snowsuit, he was unsteady on his feet but eager to explore. Anya looked at Elias, a question in her eyes. It was 45 below zero, an impossible temperature. Children did not play outside in this cold. They couldn't. Elias simply nodded. He went to the ground near the front step and brushed away the light layer of snow. He placed his bare hand flat against the soil. It was cool, but not frozen. It was the temperature of a cellar floor in autumn. He took Samuel from Anya's arms. He set the boy down on his feet in the soft snow. Samuel wobbled, then took a step, then another. He laughed, a puff of white vapor escaping his lips. He toddled across the miraculously shallow snow, his red snowsuit a beacon of color in the monochrome world. He reached down, his mitten closing around a handful of snow, and threw it playfully at Barrow, who bounded after it, kicking up small flurries. Anya stepped out, her boots sinking only an inch. She walked over to her son, her face a portrait of disbelief and joy. Elias stood in the doorway, watching his family. His wife and son were playing outside, safe and warm, in a world that was frozen solid. The air they breathed was arctic, a sharp, crystalline cold that stung the lungs, but the ground beneath their feet, the very earth they stood upon, was radiating a gentle, life-sustaining warmth. The stones were holding the memory of the fire, just as his father had said. They were breathing warmth into the heart of the killing cold. And in that moment, under a pale and frozen sun, the insane idea of a heat tunnel became the simple, profound reality of a home. The storm broke on the 5th day, leaving behind a world of profound silence and blinding white. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a cruel mockery of the devastation on the ground. The snow was piled to the eaves of houses, burying fences, roads, and outbuildings. The cold held its grip, the air so frigid it felt sharp in the lungs. From Elias's homestead, no other sign of human life was visible, only the undulating sea of snow and the distant peaks of the mountains. The first visitor arrived late that afternoon, a figure on snowshoes, struggling through the massive drifts. It was Mr. Henderson. His face was gaunt, his beard caked with ice. He stopped 50 yards from the cabin, staring. He saw the shallow snow, the clear path to the barn, the impossible sight of smoke rising from the chimney as if it were a normal winter day. He saw Anya shaking a rug on the porch, her movements unhurried. He saw Barrow lounging on the steps, not even shivering. Elias went out to meet him. Henderson leaned heavily on his walking stick, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. "My barn collapsed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The weight of the snow. Lost half my herd. The rest, they won't make it through another night like that. My wood's nearly gone. The house. It's colder inside than out, feels like." He looked past Elias, at the small, warm circle of land that defied the frozen world around it. His eyes, which had held only mockery and pity for months, now held a dawning, painful understanding. "How?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of his 70 winters of certainty, all of it now shattered. "The tunnels," Elias said simply. I said the frost heave would destroy them," Henderson stammered. "I said the ground would betray you." "The ground isn't frozen here," Elias replied, gesturing to the earth beneath their feet. "It's warm. It can't heave if it isn't frozen." Henderson stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he removed his hat, his head bowed. "I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him dearly. "I was a fool, an old, stubborn fool." He looked at Elias, his gaze direct and pleading. "My wife, Martha, she's shivering by a dying fire. Can you spare any wood?" "I can do better than that," Elias said. "Bring her here. There's room." And so they came. Henderson brought his wife, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Then came the Gable family, their youngest child suffering from frostbite. Mayor Thompson did not come himself. He sent a hired hand, his pride too great to beg for hay for his prize horses, trapped and freezing in their stables. Elias gave what he could. His small cabin became a refuge. He and Anya moved cots and blankets, brewed endless pots of coffee and soup. They tended to Mrs. Gable's son, warming his blackened toes slowly, carefully, just as his father's journals had described. The cabin was crowded and loud, but it was warm. It was alive. In the evenings, the men would go out and stare at the hooded vents, watching the heat shimmer in the Arctic air. They would place their hands on the ground and feel the impossible warmth. They talked in hushed, awed tones. They asked Elias questions, no longer with skepticism, but with the desperate curiosity of survivors. He didn't give speeches. He simply answered what they asked. "How deep did you dig?" 4 feet. "And the stone?" "From the river, laid dry." "The fire, it heats all this?" "The fire heats the stones heat the earth does the rest." It was a new catechism for a new faith. When the thaw finally came a week later, turning the valley into a treacherous mess of slush and mud, the community was changed. They had seen something that defied their understanding of the world, and it had saved some of them. The cost of the storm was high. Dozens of livestock lost, barns collapsed, homes damaged. But in the middle of it all was Elias's homestead, an undamaged testament to a different kind of wisdom. That spring, they did not just rebuild, they began to dig. Mr. Henderson was the first. He came to Elias, hat in hand, not with a request, but with a plea. "Will you show me?" he asked. "The drawings. I want to build one. For Martha." Elias did not hesitate. He brought out his father's journals, the brittle pages filled with diagrams and calculations. He and Henderson sat at the kitchen table for hours, Elias patiently explaining the principles of airflow, insulation, and thermal mass. Anya brought them tea, listening with a quiet smile. Soon, others followed. Mayor Thompson, his arrogance humbled by the loss of his finest horses, came to consult Elias on a system for his main barn. The Gables, forever grateful for the saving of their son's feet, asked for help with a smaller system for their own cabin. Elias became an unlikely teacher. He never boasted, never said, "I told you so." He simply shared the knowledge that had been passed to him. He walked their properties with them, showing them how to read the slope of the land, where to place the hearth for the best draw, how to choose the right stones. The valley became a place of immense labor. The sound of spades and pickaxes echoed from homestead to homestead. Men who had once mocked Elias's insane project now worked together, hauling stone, digging trenches, their sweat sanctifying the very ground they had once distrusted. They were not just building heat tunnels, they were building a future. They were burying their old, stubborn pride and planting a new, shared resilience. Elias and Anya's home was the center of it all, a place of pilgrimage for those seeking knowledge. Their son Samuel grew up surrounded by this energy, learning the names of stones before he learned to read. A daughter, Sarah, was born 2 years later, a child of the new era. By the time 5 winters had passed, a dozen homesteads in the valley had their own heat tunnels. The change was visible from the high ridges. In the depths of winter, the valley floor was dotted with small, dark circles of thawed earth, each one breathing a faint plume of steam, each one a sign of a warm home, a safe family, a future secured not against the winter, but in partnership with it. The town, once a place of harsh survival, was becoming a place of unique prosperity. Their livestock thrived. They could grow cold, hardy vegetables in sheltered plots long after the first frosts. Travelers caught in early storms knew the valley was a place of certain refuge. The story of Elias and his tunnels spread, carried by traders and trappers, becoming a quiet legend of the North Country. He had not set out to change his world. He had only wanted to protect his family. But in doing so, he had given his community the gift of a new season. Time flowed on, measured in winters survived and summers of gentle prosperity. The heat tunnels became the defining feature of the valley, as common and as essential as a well or a wood stove. The children who were born into this new reality took them for granted. They played in the shallow snow of their yards while the world outside was frozen, their laughter mingling with the plumes of steam rising from the earth. Elias and Anya's children, Samuel and Sarah, grew up with an intimate understanding of the system. They helped their father maintain the hearth, clear the vents, and learn to read the subtle signs of the earth's temperature. Elias, no longer the quiet, isolated young man, became the quiet, respected elder of the community. He never held a formal title, but his word carried more weight than the mayor's. He taught the next generation how to build and maintain the tunnels, his father's journals now copied and shared, the knowledge passed from hand to hand. His own hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they could still feel the perfect fit of one stone against another. He was a man who spoke little, but whose actions had reshaped the landscape and the destiny of his people. Barrow grew old. His brindle coat became shot through with gray, his muzzle white. His movements grew stiff, his energetic bounds replaced by a slow, deliberate gait. He spent most of his days sleeping in the warm spot on the floorboards directly above the main tunnel. In his 16th year, on a bright autumn afternoon, he followed Elias out to the great hearth, his steps shaky. Elias was loading the hearth for the coming winter, a ritual as old as the system itself. Barrow lay down in a patch of sun-warmed grass, his head on his paws, and watched his master work. When Elias finished, he turned to find the old dog had gone to sleep. But this was a sleep from which he would not wake. His passing was as peaceful and as quiet as his long, loyal life had been. Elias carried the old dog's body to a spot on the hill overlooking the cabin, a place where the first rays of morning sun would touch. He dug a grave in the soft, warm earth, the spade moving with a familiar, heavy rhythm. Anya and the children stood with him. There were no tears, only a profound and gentle sadness. They buried him with his favorite worn leather ball, a silent witness to a lifetime of steadfast companionship. Elias carved a simple marker from a piece of riverstone, Barrow, a good dog. For weeks afterward, Elias would find himself glancing toward the door, expecting to see the old dog waiting, his tail giving its slow, single thump of greeting. The silence he left behind was a presence in itself. Years turned into decades. Anya passed away in her sleep one spring morning, her hair as white as the snows they had conquered. Elias mourned her deeply, a quiet, abiding grief that he carried with him like a smooth stone in his pocket. His children were grown, with families of their own, living in homes warmed by the same principles he had brought to life. Samuel had become a master builder of the tunnels himself, refining his grandfather's designs, while Sarah was the town's healer, her knowledge of herbs and remedies as deep as her father's knowledge of the earth. Elias lived to be a very old man. His body was frail, but his eyes were still clear. He spent his days sitting on his porch, watching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the yard, their shouts and laughter a testament to the life he had built. He saw the valley thrive, a network of warm homes connected by a shared secret, a covenant with the ground beneath their feet. He had become a living monument, a man who had listened to the earth and taught others to do the same. One crisp winter evening, with the temperature dropping far below zero and a fresh blanket of snow covering the land, Elias felt a deep weariness settle into his bones. Sarah came to sit with him, tucking a blanket around his legs. He looked out at the familiar sight of the steam rising from the vents, shimmering under the light of a full moon. "The stones are warm," he whispered, his voice thin as parchment. "Yes, Papa," Sarah said, taking his hand. "They are. You kept us all warm." He closed his eyes, and his last breath was a quiet sigh, a gentle release into the warmth he had spent his life cultivating. They buried him on the hill beside Anya, and not far from Barrow, overlooking the home he had made. The entire valley came to pay their respects, their faces etched with a gratitude that words could not capture. They did not build him a grand monument. Instead, Samuel, his son, chose a single large, flat stone from the river, the kind Elias would have chosen for a capstone. On it, he carved a simple epitaph, the words chosen by the community he had saved. It did not speak of his stubbornness or the skepticism he had faced. It spoke only of the essential truth of his life. The stone read, "Elias Thorne. He taught us how to listen to the earth." Long after he was gone, the valley continued to thrive. His story was told and retold, a founding myth passed down through generations. And every winter, when the great storms came and the world froze, the people of the valley would look out their windows at the gentle plumes of steam rising from the ground. They would see their children playing safely in the shallow snow, and they would remember the quiet, stubborn young man who, armed with his father's dreams and his own two hands, had found a way to draw life from the heart of the cold. His legacy was not written in books or carved in marble. It was written in the land itself, in every warm floorboard, in every thriving winter garden, in every life saved from the killing frost. The heat tunnels, once a monument to one man's supposed insanity, had become a living, breathing memorial to his profound and simple wisdom.